this very special session that we are organizing in the context of the ERF Annual Conference. So the session is about our FEMISE-CMI report on post-COVID-19 opportunities for growth, regional value chains, and Mediterranean integration. So we're very happy to have you all, especially on a Saturday. We do realize that it's a bit of a demand from all of you, but I'm really hoping that we will enjoy our session. We will have lots of interesting insights and lots of interaction with our speakers and our commentators. So some housekeeping issues. This session is recorded, as you can see. It will also be available right after this session. It will be available on the YouTube channels of the ERF. And we recommend that you look at it, you share it, and you show it to your colleagues. If you have any questions, you can send them on the group chat, and please just specify the name of the person you are directing this question to, or you can wait until the end of the session where we will have a floor discussion with all our discussant, and you can raise your hands and ask your questions. 3, there is a translation to Arabic, from English to Arabic. And if you would like to access the translation, you can just press on the button of interpretation. Right, so I would like first to thank again ERF for having us in this during the conference for this session. And this report we have been producing with our partner CMI is part of a number of joint publications that we have also produced with them. We have, right after the pandemic, or right at the start of the pandemic, we decided to produce policy briefs, joint policy briefs with the CMI, which address the impact of the pandemic and the implications. And so far we've produced 22 policy briefs, and you can go to our website and the CMI website to check those policy briefs. And this report, which also is a joint effort, is another way for our two institutions to respond to the COVID crisis by bringing up some of the key issues that have been impacted by the pandemic, but also to provide mainly opportunities for change and for development. The report is available on the website since February, on the FEMISE website, on the CMI website. It's currently in English, but to access. This report cannot be more timely because first it's addressing two sectors that have been severely hit by the pandemic, namely the food and the health sectors. These two sectors have been severely hit, and the report looks into the root causes of their vulnerabilities, the challenges, but also the opportunities that they can have for their development. Second, the report looks into the opportunities for the South Med region that were created by the COVID pandemic when the countries in the world started to favor a shortening of their value chains. So a lot of potentials for the South Med countries here. Third, while the South Med countries are developing their post-COVID recovery plans, it's very important that they act on and they grab these opportunities to ensure they have resilience against future shocks. Indeed, the Ukrainian crisis had already had impacts on the food, energy, supplies, and prices, and this has been affecting the globe, including, of course, the South Mediterranean countries. And this raises again the alarm that actions are needed now, and we need to act now. So without further ado, I would like to present our speakers today that are going to address and present the report. Of course, you know all of them. They are quite high level and they're senior experts in trade, climate change, and other issues. We were going to have first Dr. Blanca Moreno-Dodson. She's the director of the CMI. Welcome, Blanca. And second, we will have Professor Patricia Ogier. She's the professor at Aix-Marseille University and Aix-Marseille School of Economics. Hello, Patricia. And Dr. Constantin Tsakas, who is the CMI UNOPS Sustainable Development Policy Senior Program Officer. Hello, Constantin. So, of course, you know them all. We will post their bios on the chat. So if you like to know more about them, please go to the chat and you will follow the link. So without further ado, Blanca, you are going to start.
Thank you very much, Maris. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you first, Maris, and also Dr. Ibrahim El-Badawi for inviting the Center for Mediterranean Integration and myself to participate in this ERF annual conference. It's my first time, and it's truly an honor and a pleasure. And I'm also very happy to be among friends, if I may say, with some of the distinguished panelists who accompany us today. And the report that we are going to present, as Maris said, represents the joint efforts between the Center for Mediterranean Integration and FEMISE. And the issues that we cover, of course, were analyzed when the pandemic started. Little we knew that we were going to have another shock, which is the conflict in Ukraine, which has only aggravated some of the issues that we pointed out in this report. Next slide, please. Prior to the pandemic, we had already been involved in some analytical work that tried to identify the reasons behind low growth performance and also lack of jobs in the Mediterranean region. And we found that mainly there were three big obstacles. I would say first, crowding out of the private sector in many countries due to the excessive weight of the public sector and lack of competitiveness, crowding out, again, a lack of access of credit and difficulties for the private sector to emerge and take off. Overall, also a weak business environment, not only limited to administrative blockages, but also other issues related to inefficient logistics and a training system that is poorly adapted to the needs of the companies, and that often creates frustration in the youth even when they are educated. And last but not least, because this is actually the main goal, the main objective of the Center for Mediterranean Integration, is that the fact that these countries in the Mediterranean have not become more integrated over time. If you look at flows of goods and services, flows of people moving around the region, and even flows of capitals, you see that there has been very little progress in the last decades. So we believe that all these factors can help explain the poor performance in growth and job creation. Next slide, please. The region needs, therefore, better integration, not only north-south, but also south-south. And what we really need in the region is projects, investment projects that don't look at one country at a time, but that look at several countries, north and south, in a way to take advantage of the extremely strategic and large market that the Mediterranean represents, and also look at opportunities to transfer technology and know-how, because when there have been investments in the past from the north to the south, etc., often they didn't come together with this transfer of technology to benefit the local population and to create local jobs. I just mentioned here two of the reports, one of them prepared by FEMISE in 2019, and another one that was a joint report, the MENA Economic Update of the World Bank and the CMI, on how to strengthen regional cooperation in order to take advantage of a crisis, of the pandemic crisis, and turn this crisis into an opportunity. And at that time, we had identified several key sectors that we then decided to analyze more in depth. So this report that we present today will focus on those sectors and will attempt to identify medium-term opportunities to increase exchanges and collaboration between the European Union and Southern and Eastern Mediterranean countries. The report is divided in three main chapters, and we will be discussing them today with you. I will be focusing first on the food security chapter. Then Patricia will elaborate on the second chapter, which looks at how to regionalize value chains and what are the opportunities that emerge and what are the products that could actually be exported to the EU coming from Mediterranean countries where the capacity to export already exists, and yet there is not demand coming from Europe. European countries continue to import those goods from other parts of the world that are farther away, such as China. I was starting to present the first chapter of the report, knowing that Patricia and Constantin will present the other two. The first chapter is dedicated to food security, which before the Ukraine conflict, we thought it was a real threat. Now it has become an emergency, but please keep in mind that this data and this analysis took place before the Ukraine conflict, of course. What's interesting to see is that the COVID-19, I need to stay on the other slide, please. Okay, here. What's interesting to see first is that there has been an increase in food insecurity in the Mediterranean. If you compare a snapshot in the beginning of the year 2000, using a 3-year average with a snapshot in 2015, 2017, we can see that for many countries, there has been an increase in food insecurity. And all this was before the pandemic. The pandemic has only aggravated this trend that had already started. What's interesting to see, if you look country by country, is that the countries in the sample in the Mediterranean, they import more cereal than they produce it. In some countries like Algeria or Jordan, the production has been flat, has not increased. While in others, as we can see, for example, in the case of Morocco, the production seems to fluctuate, and this is most likely due to the access to water and the variability in the rains. And this is why in some cycles they need to import more. But overall, we see that the Mediterranean countries import cereals more than they produce them, which is in contrast with what is happening in the sub-Saharan Africa, where the production is higher than imports. So these are all important data to keep in mind, because they really testify to the vulnerability of these countries. Next slide, please. Of course, all this has been aggravated by the pandemic. We also need to keep in mind that at the same time that we see a real risk of food insecurity, and this is not only on average for the whole region, but in some countries very much accentuated, like in the case of Egypt, for example, which is at about almost 35% of the population at risk of food insecurity. At the same time that these trends have been progressing in the wrong direction, there has also been an increase of the prevalence of obesity in adults. And this, of course, has to do with the quality of the diet. The last graph shows how, even though these countries in the Mediterranean are not considered lower income countries, but they are more in the upper, lower middle income range, we can see that there is still quite a lot of poverty. Of course, there is not as much extreme poverty as in sub-Saharan Africa, but you're still poor if you have less than $5.5 a day, and the percentage is quite high, particularly in Egypt and Morocco, reaching close to 30% of the population, which means that these people are going to be vulnerable to shocks. And this we did before the current crisis. So if you put together climate change, which is affecting the pattern of products and also rain, COVID, and now the conflict of Ukraine affecting the availability of cereals, which are so important in the Mediterranean diet, this puts these countries at great levels of vulnerability. Next slide, please. Of course, with this data, we only want to alert of the threats and emergencies that are going to come up in the region. But in the analysis, we also try to find some solutions. I will not have the time to go in detail, but I just want to highlight some of them. First of all, the agriculture strategies that are being used in these countries need to be revised, because water is more scarce than ever as a consequence of climate change, and because we need, knowing that agriculture is the #1 sector that uses water, we need production methods that are efficient, that reduce the level of evaporation, foster a more efficient use of water, and also agriculture strategies that don't marginalize some groups in the rural areas where there is a potential to produce some goods that are a necessity for those countries. There has been an exodus, as we know, from the rural to the urban areas, and this could mean that we get, of course, weaker biodiversity systems, that we get the necessity for people to migrate to be able to have a living. And this will be also very bad for the environment. So the new agriculture strategies need to take into account of all these factors. And we need to look at the rural areas in an integrated manner as a very critical sector for the development of these countries, which has not always been the case. I think a lot of the agriculture strategies have been oriented towards exports, not necessarily food security, and not necessarily on the products that are needed by the population, which has forced them to import some of those goods like cereals from other countries. Another factor that is going to be very important if we want to reduce food insecurity is improving logistics. This is all part of the endemic system that we see. And of course, one of the solutions is reviving the Mediterranean diet, which is not only good for the health of the population, but also for the environment. In terms of how to collaborate, we know that these are issues that cannot be solved one country at a time. And the North-South and South-South collaboration is going to be key to reduce the levels of food insecurity and to allow these countries to really restart producing some of the goods that they need so much. And there must be a political will behind these initiatives. In the report, which we encourage you to read, we talk about the possibility of launching a common agriculture program for the Mediterranean because the challenges are common and we need to find common solutions. It will be much more effective if we do that at the regional level. Another suggestion is to start preparing a common storage policy because storage could be one of the blockages for some of these producers, and we could think of a storage policy at the regional level again, instead of doing it one country at a time. We need to continue exchanging best practices and transfer of know-how concretely in irrigation methods and agroecology. And also we can think of how to harmonize, I would say also some of the tariff measures, but both tariff and non-tariff measures, because the agriculture sector has been actually penalized in many ways. The countries in the South still find many barriers to export agriculture goods to the north of the Mediterranean, meaning to Europe, but not only, it's not only a matter of tariffs, it's also a matter of other constraints related to quality standards, rules of origin. And again, this is something that, even though it has to be addressed country by country, we need to have a regional approach. And finally, doing joint research and training projects to focus on these issues will be very important. And at the Center for Mediterranean Integration, together with our partners from FEMISE, we are willing to take this study to the next level, particularly now taking into account the Ukraine conflict, to see what are the risks, new risks for Mediterranean countries, knowing that this could have a tremendously negative social impact. See what kind of measures can be taken and react to this really severe crisis, because if we don't find solutions, it is going to have severe social consequences. I will stay here, I will stop here, but I will be available to answer any questions. And now we continue with the presentation of the report with our colleague Patricia, who is going to present chapter 2. You will see that the 3 chapters are interlinked, but for the purpose of deepening which one of the subjects, we have divided them in 3 separate sections today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Blanca. That was perfect timing. Patricia?
Yes. Thank you very much to WeHave team for inventing us to present this report. It's a pleasure to be with you, even if we are still by the way, but I hope we can see each other very soon. So, thank you, Constantin. Concerning this chapter about new export opportunities for Mediterranean countries, we have done this work with my colleague and friend, Michael Gazurek, using trade sift software. So Michael Gazurek is a professor at Sussex University, and me, I am a professor at Aix-Marseille University and the Aix-Marseille School of Economics. So, start with the context and the motivation of this chapter. In first, the COVID crisis has revealed that the international production system are highly dependent on Asia and particularly on China. This dependence concerns all sectors, including the most sensitive. Just to give an illustration, according to EBRD, about a quarter of the inputs used in high-tech exports from the United States, Japan, Korea, and Mexico come from China. In addition, this dependence is often vis-à-vis a small number of firms. In Europe, politicians have expressed a desire to relocate the production of these intermediate goods in EU, but it's not realistic to envisage a full-scale relocation of inputs in EU unless we accept an increase in the price of finite goods and the loss of competitiveness of European products. In firms, it becomes essential to reduce the risk by a greater diversification of their suppliers without necessarily reallocating to national or European territories. Next slide, please. Can we expect this diversification to be coupled with a shortening of value chains? We think yes, for several reasons. The first is that shortening can help to improve the security of supply. The second, more important, I think, is related to the need to move toward more sustainable development. There is indeed an increasing concern about, among citizens and consumers about the environmental cost of goods. There are also regulatory changes, as for example, the carbon tax in EU, that will impact the choice of suppliers for European firms. Another factor is the increase of transport cost, in particularly maritime transport. It's maybe a short-term factor, but it could persist. Our point of view is we can expect both diversification and shortening of global value chains. Could European enterprises buy their intermediate goods in the MED countries? The next slide, please. What are the advantages of Mediterranean countries? Of course, the proximity, we will have an important reduction of the environmental impact of products in terms of product miles, carbon footprint, and reduction of transport costs. And this geographical and cultural proximity can probably help to have better control of inputs in terms of quality, compliance with standards, a better capacity to adapt products to needs, quantity, formulation change in pharmaceutical industries, for example, process change, and so on. In terms of labor cost, as wages in most competing countries have increased, the positioning of Mediterranean countries has become more favorable. Consequently, it could be interesting for EU enterprises to turn to the MED countries to buy their intermediate goods. The next slide, please. So we have tried to identify which products or in which sectors the Mediterranean countries can offer intermediate goods that European firms need. For that, we focus on intermediate goods imported by the European countries from distant low and middle income countries. Distant mean more than 7,000 from Belgium. Among these intermediate goods imported by the EU from distant low and middle income countries, we identify which of them are exported by Mediterranean countries to the world. Next slide, please. So we obtain that we call common products. We find between 400 and 500 common products at 6 digits for each Mediterranean countries. These common products are immediate opportunity for each of the Mediterranean countries to increase their export and for European firms to diversify and shorten their suppliers. At 2-digit level, we find these common products in only 7 or 9 industries. Next slide, please, Constantin. We can see here these key industries by countries. So I don't develop that. We can see the list of a few number of industries: salt, sulfur, inorganic, chemical, pharmaceutical product, and so on. Next slide, please. So I control the time. Rapidly, the main lessons from this work. Firstly, even when many countries know how to produce and export a product, it can be imported by the European Union from distant countries. It will be interesting to know which specific firms are competing with Mediterranean countries. Secondly, the EU could initiate a large-scale reshoring policy, including Mediterranean countries. Thirdly, it would be in everyone's interest to promote the implementation of long-lasting relationship between EU multinationals and Mediterranean firms. Next, fourthly, we would like to understand why EU firms prefer to buy intermediate goods from distant countries when these inputs are produced and exported by Mediterranean countries, even if Mediterranean countries have a comparative advantage in the world for these specific products. Finally, this work could be used as a first step to develop a strategy in order to increase exports on the basis of these 400 and 500 common products. So I stop here, and I can answer the questions.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very, very interesting summary of this topic. And Constantin, can you please proceed? You also have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Maryse. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So in this chapter that we co-wrote with Bruno Venteloup and Sami Moulet and also Patricia, we do three things. First, we look at how health systems in the region reacted to the COVID crisis and what weaknesses we identified that need to be resolved for future crises. A second part looks at the capacity of digital technology to improve health systems in general. And the third part focuses on the pharmaceutical industry and shows why the context of the pandemic may offer new perspectives for development of this sector. So let's start with the weaknesses. One of the first things we noted was how there is, as you of course know, a two-tier system that is in place in Med countries that leads to a general problem of quality of care in the public health system. So very often we notice that the backbone of the public system is provided by a network of national hospitals, but there is also a parallel system of a private nature. Especially in Maghreb countries, you see that doctors can participate in both systems, which of course can pose a problem of loyalty to the public system, a lack of transparency for the patient, and so on. And this of course has implications when you need to have an effective control of a health crisis. So in the case of COVID, one could say that those that were in need of urgent care were not served in the same way, depending on whether they were just depending on the public system, or if they were sufficiently wealthy to access the private system. What our analysis also does is that it highlights how public hospitals in all countries suffer from underinvestment, which is linked, of course, to tight public budgets over the years. And as with infrastructure, of course, Med countries generally suffer from a chronic deficit in human resources also for health. We notice, for example, migration of health personnel, brain drain, and the private sector, of course, that is more attractive. Last but not least, we also see that countries suffer from a lagging development of international health coverage. In Tunisia, Jordan, and Algeria, perhaps there's a better collective coverage of health costs, but this remains far from being a universal protection system. So we basically argue that all these factors taken together, this poor development of health insurance also in some of the countries has prevented managing the epidemic effectively. Next slide, please. Now, after identifying the weaknesses, we stressed how, of course, there's potential for a better response to epidemics, and there are a series of actions that can be taken, which include decentralization and the development of primary care, setting up partnerships with the private sector, free care, regional cooperation, last but not least, with the sharing of good practices, international cooperation with the WHO, and so on. Next slide, please. So, what we also do is that since we're talking about solutions, is that we dedicate a part of this chapter to discuss how digitalization can be one of the solutions to improve the health systems. Why digitalization? Well, for a number of reasons. For one, digital services can help counteract the negative effects of highly centralized healthcare. You have ICT, you have telemedicine. With all of that, it is now possible to offer medical consultations remotely to populations that might be in landlocked regions. And this, of course, can be truly useful for the Mediterranean that has lots of rural areas. Then, of course, digitalization can be a preventive and curative tool, which reduces the number of trips to the hospital to see a doctor. Self-management of health can be very effective for Med countries that face increasing rates of non-communicable diseases. And last but not least, digitalization also allows improved and faster access to medical records, which is very useful, of course, in terms of efficiency gains, something which, by the way, Egypt has understood quite well, as it had its 100 Million Lives campaign, which generated a significant amount of medical data with such a digital system. Next slide, please. So there is definite potential of course, but again, lots of challenges as well, related more specifically to the digital readiness in the Mediterranean. That should not be underestimated. So the graph that you see here breaks down the digital readiness index for each Med country and compares it with neighboring countries. And we immediately see that the human capital element of Med countries appears to lag behind in terms of digital readiness. With the exception of Jordan, for instance, we see that all countries rank below the average obtained in the EU and that obtained of the Asia-Pacific region. Furthermore, we also see that the level of public and private investment in the Med countries is quite low in terms of digital readiness, only equal to that of sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. We also see that Med countries still have to solve problems of network deployment that's related to infrastructure and to financial accessibility. We note that in our report how network security must be reinforced. It's important to have a sufficient number of secure internet servers which are intended to store publicly accessible content. We actually see that the number of secure internet servers in Med countries is very low, and it's actually 4 times less than what you have in sub-Saharan Africa, even though 5 years ago the situation was actually the opposite. Med countries had more secure servers than sub-Saharan Africa. There's a whole dimension also, of course, that needs to be considered with regards how sensitive data is handled, and also with regards unequal access to connections, which can jeopardize the stability of a country, can increase social inequalities, including in the field of access to health. So we see that countries such as Jordan and Lebanon, they have a head start in bridging the digital divide, but you have other countries that still have a way to go. Next slide, please. So we talk about the potential, we talk about the challenges, but now how do we move forward? So what we say is that to facilitate the emergence of a digital ecosystem, digital health ecosystem, there is room to do 4 things. First of all, to facilitate investment in business digitalization, both private and public, including through FDI, through R&D spending, attracting talented people through tax incentives, for instance, for startups, because we see that it's essentially very small enterprises and SMEs that are often the first to suffer from the lack of digitalization. A second point is to develop the technological infrastructure, of course, to facilitate access to mobile broadband and so on, to develop the workforce, supporting digital innovation. So here it would seem appropriate, for instance, to have specific policy measures that are aiming at raising the level of e-health education of individuals, including of medical staff. And last but not least, the need to develop strong institutions, both formal rules, regulations, but also informal regulations. Next slide, please. We actually also did some work looking at examples of potential Med e-health startups that could be supported, replicated, and included in national health strategies. So this slide basically presents this selection. I will not go one by one, but just to show you that there are e-health startups in each country that actually provide tangible responses to the needs of local populations. And if they're included by authorities in the national health plan, then the countries could greatly gain also by replicating them, by scaling them up, by connecting them with donors, and so on. Next slide, please. Since we talk about what could be done, the last factor that, and perhaps the most important, and I will finish my presentation there, is the need for cooperation on a regional and international scale. As you know, with the rising debts, with deteriorating budget balances, Med countries have little room for maneuvering. So there is need for cooperation. And we believe that especially in the EU, Mediterranean, African axis, this would make great sense. You have countries like Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, for example, that are linked by a telecommunications highway, which offers a higher level of connectivity. Egypt is also strengthening its position as a digital hub in Africa. So all in all, there are things that could be made to enhance regional cooperation. We also argue how digital technologies can have a significant potential for the pharmaceutical sector and integration in pharmaceutical value chains. And here I will leave the floor to Patricia for a closing comment on that specific issue. Thank you very much. Patricia?
Just some words.
2 minutes, Patricia.
2 minutes. Yes, it's enough. It's enough. So the pharmaceutical industry constitute a priority sector in the 5 Mediterranean countries, and we can see a real development of production capacities, with an important role of the FDI in this development of production capacities. So, as I said, for the previous chapter, it's well for the pharmaceutical industry. The dependence on China and India concerns specifically this sector, and we can do the same observations for this industry. And there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration between EU multinationals and firms in Mediterranean countries, specifically in this sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Blanca, Constantin, Patricia, for very, very short compared to the report, but very punctual and very accurate presentation. I do invite you all to go and read the report, and I would like to go to our commentators, which I will start by presenting first. And thank you all for your patience and for coming back after all this. So anyway, I would like to present our first commentator, Professor Bernard Hockman, who's a professor and director at the Global Economics at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, European University Institute. Our second commentator is Dr. Raed Safadi, who's the chief economist at Dubai's Department of Economic and Tourism. And our third commentator is Mr. Bernard Ziller, who's the senior advisor in the Institutional Strategy Division of the European Investment Bank, where he is also an economist, loan officer, and a policy advisor. So I also advise you to look at their bios. It's on the chat now. And I would like to first ask, the first question will be to our 3 commentators. So I'll just ask you one by one. So as we saw in the first chapter of the report, which was presented by Blanca, that there is fragility in the food security in the region and dependency on imports, especially on cereals, which are clearly going to be further impacted by the Ukrainian crisis. So from your expertise, how can the region meet this challenge in the context of a food value chain, climate change, water scarcity, and regional cooperation? I will ask first Professor Hockman to give us his insights, and then I will ask the other commentators to also give their own vision as well. Professor Hockman.
Okay, thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you. I understand we probably have a bit less time than we thought we would have, given the interruption. So I'll keep it brief so that everybody can speak. So on the food question, so I would stress one thing that is in the report and one thing that is not. And I think the one that is not is kind of relevant, given that it is a trade report focusing on GVCs. So the one thing that is in there is, if you think about food security and how you get to be in a more secure environment for food consumption, what you need is money, right? So income. So I think the dealing with restarting growth, reducing poverty, kind of getting things moving again and better moving in terms of the economy is, I think, extremely important, right? And I think here the report at the beginning, it says a little bit about the context, right? For example, tourism has collapsed, and that, of course, is a major source of income for many households. So clearly, it seems to me that, of course, there is a need to focus on food per se, but I think the key thing we know from experience around the world with food crises, many of them, unfortunately, over time, it really is a function of generating the income to be able to pay for the food, which inevitably is going to increase in price. So I think that's one, and it's there in the report, but I would just re-emphasize that. And in particular, link it back to the COVID shock, in particular, whole sectors having been essentially decimated and subjected to lockdown, which of course has been a huge hit in terms of income. The one that strikes me that is not there on the food side. So, you know, we've been through food crises numerous times in the past. And one of the things that was put in place in the earlier 2000s when we went through this was a system for monitoring what's going on world commodity markets. Now here, of course, we have wheat in particular as a locus because of the war in Ukraine. But I think one of the things that you need to worry about, and already beginning to see this, is countries imposing export restrictions. Right now, of course, in the case of Ukraine, it's involuntary, but there are also countries that have said, okay, we're seeing these spikes, so therefore we're going to restrict exports of these types of commodities. So I think one of the antidotes that was put in place in the 2000s was this agricultural monitoring information system to actually identify, is there excess? Yes, clearly there's excess demand, which we see reflected in prices, but what does the supply situation look like, right? And where is there excess capacity? Where is there excess supply? Where are there stocks? So I think one of the things that I would put forward here in terms of dealing with this is actually asking, okay, so how is this working and where are those? You know, what does the supply-demand balance look like globally and where can we kind of source imports from? I think a lot of the export restrictions historically are knee-jerk reactions by governments without any understanding or thinking about what the supply situation actually looks like. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Werner. Very enlightening. What would be Dr. Safadi's opinion on this issue, complementing what Professor Hockman just mentioned? You're muted. Just put your mic on. Yes, perfect.
Sorry about that. I can only compliment what Bernard just said. First, let me thank you also for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to see you all. It was also a real pleasure to read this report. Congratulations to the authors. They've done a great job. I'll take my cue from what Bernard said, that this is mainly a trade report, and I'll get there in due course. Now, if you think about the challenges in the area of food security, and Bernard covered a very important one, which is related to the folly of applying export restrictions, which we also saw in the context of the pandemic on health products and pharmaceuticals and what have you. So moving on, if you look at the challenges as they are in the Middle East region, the first one is, you know, we all know that the MENA is the most water-stressed region globally. And according to many studies, including the World Bank, it will experience the highest economic losses from climate-related water scarcity compared with other global regions. Estimates range between 6 to 14% of their GDP loss by 2050. Add to this challenge, the population growth rate in the region is the highest worldwide and is expected to reach 700 million people in 2050, when at that time, per capita water availability will also be half. At the same time, you'll see agricultural productivity rates have not kept up actually with population increase. Another challenge comes from the fact that we are exceptionally dependent on food inputs, especially on imports of wheat and other staple grains. Close to half of MENA's food is imported. I'm not talking about the GCC countries where that ratio could reach 80 to 90%. Another challenge is related to food wastage, that continues to be an issue in MENA region. If you look at the FAO estimates, they estimate that an average of 250 kilograms of food is lost per person in the MENA region each year. So in view of these such challenges, and I go back to the trade issue, it is clear that MENA economies will be unlikely able to grow sufficient cereals domestically and achieve cereal sufficiency or food security, if you will. The region definitely needs to imports from around the world. And therefore, closer and deeper cooperation between the two shores of the Mediterranean in this area has the potential to produce win-win solutions. Now, how about establishing an agricultural, the papers, the FEMISE report talks about cooperation, a common agricultural program, but that remains, calling it a program remains a bit fluid. We want to talk about, a deeper type of a cooperation between the two shores of the Mediterranean. Open trade between the two shores, right? A customs union, let's say, in agricultural products, where producers in the South Mediterranean countries produce high-value crops with free access to the European markets, and MENA importers also can be provided tariff-free access to European cereals and other staple foods. But that common agricultural program, if you will, needs much more. It needs technical assistance from the EU to MENA region. The EU can advise and support regulating water use and water management in general, waste management and technology transfer from the EU's agricultural research organizations, as well as targeted investments in high-tech farming facilities, all of which will go to support MENA economies in their transition from traditional agriculture to high-tech, low-resource input agriculture. Thank you. I'll stop at this and come back and to elaborate on any one of these points.
Thank you. Thank you, Raed, for this very specific proposals, which is something that FEMISE and CMI actually have been looking at. Common agriculture program. This is one of the things that we can really carry on and try and impact maybe policymakers on the importance of this type of cooperation. I will also give the floor to Bernard Ziller if you would like to add something to this, please.
Thank you, Maryse. Well, actually very little. First of all, because I cannot claim to have any particular expertise in this field, so no point in pretending I do. But it seems to me this is typically a kind of squaring the circle kind of situation, where I think the previous speakers have well outlined what the key constraints are, and that all of them, each one of them, is not easy to address for various reasons. Some that are homegrown, and others that are linked to the environment, and some actually which are linked to natural factors, let's say, that nobody controls. So, but I would agree that part of the things that need to be done could be around improving the production. Maybe there's, and I'm not a scientist, but I think maybe science has something to bring to the table in terms of indeed making food production more efficient and more effective. And in that sense, transfer of knowledge from other parts of the world may be quite relevant and even necessary. What I don't have a sense for is the extent to which this can be achieved, whether we're talking at the margin or really whether we can achieve very significant gains, and also how much time it may take to achieve these results. Because clearly, since we're talking of food, we're talking about things that are urgent by nature. We're not talking about something that is nice to have, but something that everyone needs on a daily basis. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernard, for this comment. I will move to my second question, and it's for Professor Hochman. So in light of what the report has shown in terms of opportunities of integration in the global value chains, how can the South Med countries capitalize on these opportunities offered following the redesigning of the global value chain? So how can they capitalize on this?
Yes, well, that's a question we've been asking ourselves for many, many years. So I think even though the question's been there for a long time and the world has been changing. So I think the one thing that I would stress is that external change, which is partly endogenous, partly exogenous. And if you think about where are these big changes, if you think about, okay, so where were we when we had these types of discussions 10 years ago and today, there's 4 big changes, and they're not necessarily all reflected in the reports, but as the report also says, the report is targeting specific types of questions and piggybacking on a lot of other research that has already been done. But these 4 kind of big changes are, one, the geopolitics have changed a lot, right? So we have this competition between the United States and China. We have, of course, now a war in Europe, the first one in a long time. So geopolitical tensions are everywhere, and they're really affecting the decisions of firms, right? In terms of how you design your supply chain, where you locate. So we're really moving away from just in time to just in case type of activities, and a real focus by firms on hedging behavior, which doesn't mean reshoring, but it really means, we're going to rethink where we actually place production facilities. Now, this is stressed in the report, and it's clearly an opportunity for the region, or at least parts of the region. But there's 3 other factors that play in. So one is climate change, right? So clearly that's having a huge impact on policy in particular, and firms are responding to that policy. And here it's a bit of an open question to me. So what is going on in the MENA region in terms of actually both imposing regulations, but also responding to the regulations that are being put in place by the United States, by the European Union, right? So we have the prospect of a carbon border adjustment mechanism coming online relatively fast. We have a lot of focus on reducing carbon emissions within supply chains. And there is a huge amount of work that has been going on for quite a while by lead firms to actually deal with these types of challenges. So that's something the region and firms in the region are really going to have to play with, respond to, and show that they actually satisfy these different types of requirements. Now, I have no idea, again, I've not worked on this, but so to what extent are governments actually awake to this? Are they helping to put in place equivalent types of regulations so that you can actually signal to potential investors that, we will not be an impediment to you when you have to show whether you're in compliance or not with these regulations in export markets? The third thing, of course, that's really changed is the pandemic, right? So we've seen a huge disruption of supply chains, which are in part due to the lockdowns, which are in part due to a shift towards consumption of tangibles as opposed to intangibles. And to a large extent, it's a function of the optimization of supply chains before the pandemic, which really meant that any disruption gets magnified over time. And I think it's fair to say that most people in our world have been surprised at how long this has taken and how severe that disruption actually was. But I think, again, you need to then reflect upon that. It's not enough to say, okay, we're closer to Europe, so therefore that gives us an advantage in terms of doing this. You really need to think about, okay, so extent for an effective way of diversifying that is cost efficient, and clearly there are opportunities. So to go back to the report and the health chapter, Right now, one of the things that is happening, of course, is that developing countries are extremely irritated, to use a polite word, at the fact that rich countries are essentially hoarding vaccines and essentially putting their citizens first. Now, that's perfectly understandable politics, but nonetheless, there is a huge imbalance in vaccination rates. Right, so one of the responses has been, well, local production. Now, local production in an environment where you don't have a comparative advantage and you don't have the technology is difficult, but nonetheless, I think this is an area where regional cooperation actually can work, right? We have a pharmaceutical industry in Jordan. We have capacity in the region. Now, maybe this is happening, maybe it's not. I didn't see it in the chapter, but it seems to me that this is an area where you actually need supply chains, where you have both local demand, regional demand. So that's, again, an opportunity that comes out of the pandemic, where I think certainly both firms and governments are going to be much more inclined to put money on the table to actually foster that technology transfer to make this work. Right, so I know it's happening in places like South Africa. I don't know whether this is happening in the region, but it seems to me it's a real opportunity. And then the final point I'd make on the external environment, and then I'll stop, is there's an increasing focus on values, right? Labor is a good example, but environment is also an example of values. And that's really being reflected in regulatory requirements, which are quite burdensome, right? So the EU is in the process of putting in place a due diligence directive, right? So that basically means firms need to know what's going on inside their supply chain. And you can't just tick the box, right? This is serious. There are serious civil penalties, and there was initially even talk of criminal liability if you don't do that. Now, I think that's off the table, but it is serious. Now, is that something that the environment is geared up for to deal with? Are firms ready to actually do what is going to be required in the next couple of years to actually participate and to be part of these value chains? So again, that's a question. So yes, geographically, there's an opportunity, but from a regulatory environment, it's becoming increasingly challenging. So, so that's more of a question than anything else, but I think it's important to kind of think about how the world has changed also for supply chains in terms of leveraging and harnessing the opportunities that may exist. And a lot of this revolves around public-private partnerships, which is not something the region is particularly good at, right? So let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Hoffman, for 4 points that are definitely another next study on that. The following question will be presented by Patricia, that there are 400 to 500 common products that are imported by the EU and at the same time exported by the Mediterranean countries. However, the level of these products are really low. So why is it the case? And just to complement a little bit what Bernard Hoffman was saying, is there a chance for the Mediterranean countries, to put it bluntly, to replace China, in your opinion? You can unmute your phone. You are still on, yes.
Yes, yes. Sorry about that. I did not unmute myself. So there are certainly many opportunities to redirect. Certainly the pandemic has catalyzed supply chain changes that were already underway. It is promoting nearshoring and more extensive digitization and more sustainable production networks and practices. It is also the case that the current geopolitical crisis in Europe is giving more arguments in favor of this reorientation of GVCs and towards the MENA region. This actually bodes well for Med countries on a number of fronts that I won't get into here. I take what Bernard has just said, the important development that is coming from the climate change and the commitments that MENA countries have taken on for zero emissions by 2050, right? And of course, you know, if you were to think about it, the carbon border tax adjustment that the EU has introduced. Now, where your report comes in handy is that it identifies those products actually that where MENA country, where you know, the EU firms can reorient towards MENA countries, but inadvertently you could see that most of these actually have high carbon content in them, and that calls for what? It calls for cooperation, further cooperation between the two shores of the Mediterranean, especially since if you were to think about the 5 targeted goods that present high risk for carbon leakage, by the EU: cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, and electricity. All of these goods figure as intermediate inputs in the list of products, save for pearls maybe, that the EU is currently importing from Asia at an increased risk and at higher carbon footprint. Now, if you were to think about the EU carbon tax adjustment, it only tackles one environmental externality, if you will, the price. It does not address the knowledge externality. Low carbon technologies and skills transfers from the EU to its southern neighbors is a critical element in this regard, lest the EU carbon tax adjustment will end up pushing carbon-intensive production outside Europe. But let me follow up on what I just said earlier regarding food insecurity issue and my call for an agricultural customs union or a deeper cooperation in agriculture. This is most relevant in today's envisaged deep and comprehensive free trade area that is currently under negotiation with Tunisia and Morocco, and that is not faring well, right, at this stage. So maybe we should go for a more gradual approach based on sectoral agreements, at least in the short to medium term, in the same vein as we have done in agriculture, or what we are calling for in the agricultural field. Why don't we call in these in terms of the industrial products, especially those that have high carbon content in them. So in order to strengthen the intra-regional economic and value chain integration, modernization of the convention that has so far been between the two shores need to be revisited. Sorry, the convention, what is it called? Pan-European Euro-Mediterranean Convention, right? So it is a priority area. Integrated and broader long-term plans also need to be put in place in these sectors. It is imperative, right? I mean, instead of talking about the deep and comprehensive free trade area, which has been very hard to translate into something tangible, we think about deeper cooperation in agriculture, that this report has said, also deeper cooperation in industrial goods, and why not focus it on those with higher carbon content. So we want the EU now to not just to internalize the price of environmental bad, but also to internalize knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Raed, for this. So just to pick up from where you just said and about agreements, I'm turning to Bernard Zeller to ask, so what do you think couldn't you think that this could be a good potential, as mentioned in Patricia's slides in the chapter 2, for the African continental free trade? That's my first question. And also, what could be the role of international organizations such as the EU to help the South Mediterranean countries within the agreements to be more integrated in the value chain? Please. Thank you.
Well, let me first start with a very short personal anecdote. Actually, in the early days of the pandemic, I think really it was in April 2020, I immediately thought about this issue, to be honest. And I was still working at the UFM at the time, and I did mention this to colleagues there at the time. They, in the meantime, were supposed to do some study, but I understand they haven't concluded it yet. But basically, my idea was that, yes, given the circumstances, there was probably, in principle, then the doability is a different issue, and there are many constraints, but a certain logic for moving in the direction that is being recommended. So at least at the least diversification in terms of value chains, and possibly some form of nearshoring. Reshoring is would be too extreme, and therefore maybe there was a potential, that maybe there was an opportunity for countries on the southern shore of the Mediterranean to pick up on that and to benefit from it. And well, as a mutual benefit actually for both sides, of course. But so that was my intuition, and something that was worth working on, which I haven't done, of course. So I was very happy to see that Patricia and her colleague actually picked it up and carried out some more concrete data work on this. But it seems to me that the logic is there, and an additional factor I see now that makes it even more valuable, maybe, but also maybe a bit more realistic politically, is the return of geopolitics that was mentioned before. I think we were still living until not so long ago in a world of looking at the issues of trade from an economic perspective, and so therefore, let's say free trade in general would be the starting point. I think well, because of the particular role of China, but now of course even more so, even if it's not directly related, because of the ongoing conflict in between Russia and Ukraine, or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I should say. I think all of a sudden geopolitics becomes even more important, and I'm sure that it is also seen that way in the EU. So to me, this gives more political credibility to the kind of scenario that is being envisaged and proposed. Whether this will then materialize, of course, is a different matter, because we know that well, the EU is a big bureaucratic machinery, I can say so, being somehow part of it. So there will be many obstacles and many reasons to restrict what can be done. And of course, the business case for it also still has to be made. In theory, the arguments in the paper provide a strong basis, but then of course, whether actually concretely specific firms in the countries will be able to produce the goods for which they might have a comparative advantage all of a sudden in the new framework in a competitive way that provides the right quality, and that is also supplying the goods on time and things like that, has all the infrastructure in place. That I really don't know. But I think it's a good place to start, and certainly something worth exploring. And I would add then, from the more concrete financing side, let's say, coming from the EIB or from the EU, there's maybe an additional positive signal, which is the EU's initiative on the global gateway, because that is also a way of, it's a kind of new form of industrial policy in a way, right? It's a way of taking certain things into the EU's own hands and trying to build or rebuild the globalization in a different way, in a proactive manner. And this is again very political, and then creates financial resources to support it. And indeed, an institution such as the EIB, alongside the European Commission, is part of the machinery that is supposed to contribute to the implementation. Basically, I think, you know, there will be opportunities to at the EU level to provide guarantees to support investments, and to develop partnerships, to have new value chains being developed. So I think the EIB contributes to that in some areas already. Of course, for all of this to work, you need to have the right transport infrastructure in place, and this is also the kind of things that with always, as by definition, the support from the EU, the EIB is something that we are financing, and we develop local productions. For example, in some areas we've been financing the Institut Pasteur in Dakar for the local production of medicine and vaccines. So this is a different example that may be driven by different reasons, but if it can be done there, and if it's being done there, I don't see why not in other areas. So I would say that I find the direction of travel that is being put forward in the paper to be a rather convincing and realistic one, but at the same time, of course, it would only work if the agreements can be reached, and if the underlying legal frameworks make it possible. And there may be further geopolitical changes that may move in a different direction, the opposite direction, of course. But that's how I would look at it. Thanks.
Thank you, Bernard. So we know there are like things that the South Mediterranean countries need to do. There are things that the EU side need to do. There is a whole regulatory framework that needs to change. But where do we start from? I mean, how can we be concrete about this? And I'm going to ask Safadi this last question. How can we be concrete about integrating the South Med into the global value chain? Maybe I'll also ask Bernard Hockman to give his input on this, and then I will ask the authors to comment.
Well, thank you, Maryse. Listen, you start from the premise of the paper where you've identified, you know, those products, and as I said, those products have high carbon content in them. Extend beyond those products to all those high carbon, right? And seek cooperation agreements with the EU to deepen, you know, research and development, new technologies. As I said, you know, both parties have a lot to gain in here, right? At the end, you know, we have global targets to reach, you know, to fight climate change, right? And as I said, the carbon tax, border tax adjustment of the EU just internalizes the price of these environmental bads. Now we want to internalize the knowledge, and therefore they have an interest in also sharing that knowledge and, you know, developing it further. And now that will also help the MENA countries that have also committed themselves to reach certain targets for the CO2 neutrality. Now, put that aside, so not just the products that have been identified by the FEMISE, but extend it more. And I was expecting Bernard Hockman actually to come and talk about services, right? So here services have not been identified here as providing opportunities. It's just the neighborhood effect, talk about transportation, but you go beyond that. Beyond that, in terms of, you know, the digitization, the research and development, tourism, and also all the backbone, you know, banking, finance, insurance, all of these things. There's so much to be developed in terms of the two shores of the Mediterranean, that is in the best interest of both parties, right? As I said, you know, if you were to look at a deep and comprehensive free trade area that is supposed to tackle all these issues with all the, you know, pushes and pulls from different sides, why don't we just, you know, try to compartmentalize these into different areas where actually the underlying premise is how do we improve cooperation to the benefit of both parties along very defined sectors or activities or what have you, R&D, pharmaceutical production, all of these things. I mean, you take, Bernard alluded to what happened during the food security, right? Where countries did export restrictions and ended up shooting themselves in the foot, right? I mean, here you had a chance where farmers in developing countries would have earned higher income due to you know, those supply-demand disequilibria, and then, you know, their governments prevented them from doing so, and also, you know, with repercussions to the the global agricultural market. The same has happened now, you know, within the first with at the beginning of the COVID-19, and then with the vaccination, whereby, you know, the bigger thy neighbor trade policies have become, as one of my friends called it, sickened thy neighbor type of policy, right? And in the same vein, prevented firms in the MENA region to actually, you know, invest in those activities with the promise of future sales or future exports to Europe and elsewhere. So we need, you know, I fully understand and I fully appreciate the level of political sensitivity and geopolitics that are at play now, but they can also point at the same time to further cooperation, for further interdependencies, and hopefully that will usher in a new area where both parties can find the common denominators across all this. Sorry, I took too much. I'll end here.
No, it's perfect. Bernard Hoffman, would you like to add something to this about services, which of course we didn't address this, and I will give the floor to Blanca maybe to respond to all of this. But from what I understand, that is something that we could explore. Unfortunately, Patricia, for some reason, got disconnected. But this is something that we might be thinking about in the future, to do the same exercise for the services, which I agree is essential for the region. I will give the floor to Bernard Hoffman first, and then after that to Blanca, and then Constantin to respond.
Okay, let me just say I agree completely with Raed. So, you know, it's been going on for decades. I mean, I remember going to Egypt in the 1980s when, you know, they were already talking about an agreement with the EU. Fine, and here we are in 2022, and we're still talking about, you know, oh, why aren't services in trade agreements? So I think it's very clear to me that this is pushing on a string, right? And I think this whole deep and comprehensive FTA is simply dead in the water for whatever reason, right? Now, I'm a big advocate, but, you know, it's so politically it's dead. It's not working. And I think everybody kind of recognizes it, but they keep it going even though it is dead. So we need to focus much more on identifying where there are win-wins, right? And I think doing this on a sectoral basis, doing this on a policy specific basis, doing this around areas where there clearly there are stakeholders on both sides who want to make this happen, right? And not pollute it with your traditional mercantilist negotiations where you immediately get French farmers to agitate against everything and vice versa on the South Mediterranean side. So I think that's one of the lessons we took way too long to learn. Now, the problem with that, and I've written papers on this in terms of, you know, open plurilateral agreements and why they're much better than trade agreements because they're separable and all the rest of it. The problem is MENA governments aren't part of this game, right? So they don't like trade agreements, but they also don't like these sectoral things, right? So how many Arab countries are part of the joint statement initiative negotiations in the WTO? Very few. right? The rest of the world is out negotiating digital economic partnership agreements because they recognize that we live in a services world where digitalization is the name of the game. And we have governments in the Arab world, aside from the small part where Raad lives, you know, basically not focusing on this at all. So I think what really needs to change is the signal. So there are different instruments you can use. Trade agreements is one. You don't like trade agreements, use these other types of plurilateral initiatives. But you know, you've got to engage. And the lack of engagement is a clear signal that the region is not in this business. And it's really depressing. So I don't want to end on a depressing note, but I think there's a lot you could do, and maybe start with digital, right? So everybody should be on board in this e-commerce discussion in Geneva, but insofar as they're not, you need to have at least a coherent explanation for why not and what's missing and what's wrong. And then sit around the table with your major potential export markets and figure out what do we need to do, right? Now, I think the number one thing I would do if I was advising governments is to say, sit around the table with the EU and get a data adequacy agreement, right? So actually show that the regulatory environment in our countries is completely equivalent to that in the European Union. Both from a values point of view, from a data protection point of view, and from an economic point of view. So start that process, knock on the door. Now, you don't knock on the door of DG Trade, you have to knock on the door of DG Justice. But, you know, get that process going. And I think until we see that sign of life, those signals, I really am not going to be particularly optimistic that we're going to see big differences happening anytime soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Bernard, for this very interesting and realistic. I have lots to say, but I talk too much, and I will give to Blanca first to respond and to give her views, and then Patricia, and then Constantin, and then I'll take some questions from the floor. Thank you for those who stayed. You will give you the chance to talk if you like. So Blanca, please.
Well, thank you very much to all the commentators for giving us very interesting suggestions. Some of them were already in our radar screen, but some others are offer a different dimension. And thank you for being so frank. I unfortunately tend to agree with you, Bernard, and I definitely think that we need to keep knocking on whatever doors we can, but we need more political will. We keep talking about Mediterranean integration, but yet when you look even at the new EU neighborhood policy, which is more comprehensive than ever, and it comes also accompanied by bigger amounts of investment, but we don't see yet the concrete actions taken off. Now we have the huge destruction of Ukraine, maybe, but also we need political will in the South and more dialogue South-South, because the countries in the South would have more weight when talking to the EU if there was more political dialogue between them. So I really like the idea of maybe acting on policy-specific issues or some particular sectors. And one of the things that the CMI was planning to do is to analyze more in depth some of the value chains in some sectors. For example, agri-food, health, look more in detail at the regional value chain in some of those sectors, and that could be perhaps enlightening. The other thing that comes to mind for me is to keep giving incentives to the private sector, because if the private sector is really moved by incentives and they see the possibility of doing more business in the region, for example, improve the connectivity, help them with the connectivity, help them with transport, help them with services, as you mentioned, then they could also make things happen, because it is not happening either at the level of firms. So keep working on what's bothering, what are the bottlenecks that are preventing the firms from doing business across the Mediterranean. And then, of course, I agree with you, Bernard, the regulations are outdated in many of these countries and they are not in line with the EU. But I think we need a really a bigger political push from the EU. I'm sorry to say, I think we need that. If the EU is really serious about Mediterranean integration, we need more political push and we need a true dialogue. And one of the issues is lack of internal consensus within the House, within the EU. for example, about the deeper trade agreements, that is, in my opinion, my modest opinion, that is the issue, that not all members of the EU see those deeper trade agreements as a necessity. And of course, in the South, because of the results in the past, there have been disappointments. They were asymmetric, they were partial, they benefited the EU more than they benefited them. So the dialogue is there, as you said. But we need to wake it up. And I agree with some of the suggestions that you made. And perhaps the crisis come at the time when, if we know how to ride them, this could turn into opportunities. And this is what we try to say in the report. We try to stay optimistic, use the COVID as an opportunity to change with the value chains. Also, the fact that there are some products that offer clear comparative advantages for which the capacity in the South already exists. I think that the next step is to talk to the private sector and ask them specifically why, if these products could come now at the time when maritime transport costs have increased and everybody is more concerned about decarbonization, what is blocking you? What would block you from importing these goods from the South? And have that conversation. And the CMI is well placed to have this conversation with you, academics, private sector and governments and civil society to try to identify those blockages and try to get more light on to what could be done to promote de facto this Euro-Mediterranean integration. Maybe I'll stop here. I have many more things to say, but I want to leave time for my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Blanca. Patricia, can you give us your insights and comments, please?
You look muted.
It's okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for your comments. I am agree with a lot of comments that you did. Thank you very much. So just in some minutes, in some few minutes, we have designed this report as a starting point to show where the main challenges and opportunities are, and with an operational dimension in the chapter 2. But now there are a lot of work to do, and it's clear to highlight a lot of parts in this this report is just the starting point to go on, to continue to deepen, to work again on this in this specific subject. But thank you very much. Thank you very much again for all and for the organization, Maryse.
Thank you, Pat. Constantin, please, can you give us your final?
Sure. Very quick comment, because I think Blanca synthesized it quite well. A comment with regards to CBAM, that the carbon border adjustment mechanism that Raed talked about. Indeed, it's a crucial issue because indeed most of the products that we've identified, they are in what we call brown sectors, and as we know, most of the jobs also in the South Med countries are in such brown sectors. So there's a whole discussion to be had as to how trade integration in global value chains, taking into consideration what is happening with the EU Green Deal, with the green transition in Europe, and what this entails for the neighborhood, how this can also have repercussions for the jobs of the South Med countries. And actually, this is the next step that we've undertaken. CMI is closely working with the World Bank on follow-up report of sorts, which is going to be about trade and jobs, which basically the starting point is to say, why did the association agreements, why didn't they lead to concrete gains in terms of the labor market, in terms of reducing inequalities as well, and so on, and what needs to be done in general, but also in terms of future DCFTAs, when and if these ever occur. So we've set up a team. We're also working with people from ERF, from FEMISE. The International Trade Center also in Geneva is on board with us, and we're all working together on this follow-up report. And maybe Blanca, you would like to say a few words. And also maritime transport is for us a key component. As part of a different project, we're discussing how to rethink regional connectivity, maritime transport connectivity across the South Med countries, Africa, and the EU, how the Fit for 55 package of the European Union can also have an impact and be maybe a starting point for South Med countries to also green their maritime transport component. So yeah, these are my 2 cents. Maybe Blanca, you want to pick it up.
Thank you, Constantin. Blanca, you want to say some final words before?
No, thank you, Constantin. You already mentioned indeed that this is a work in progress. In addition to what Constantin said, the work on maritime transport, how to decarbonize maritime transport, is something we're going to do with the World Bank. The report on trade and jobs, the same, it's ongoing with all the partners that Constantin mentioned. Perhaps just to say that I think on the food security chapter, because of the Ukraine crisis, we also have to do deeper analysis. For example, what does it mean to have a Euro-Mediterranean agriculture policy? What kind of measures can be taken at the regional level to reduce food insecurity? So we're open to your ideas. I think this is supposed to be a dialogue driven by demands and by needs. And also, thank you, Bernard Ziller, for being there. And maybe we can also discuss with you on how to establish a clearer link with investments and the role that the European Investment Bank can play in the region, which would be critical, because all these knowledge pieces are great, but we also need investments. This region is in desperate need of investments. Investments in infrastructure, they're still missing. Investments in digitalization is still missing. Constantin showed it in some of the graphs. And also we need investments that truly become vehicles for transfer of know-how and technology, which is very much needed in all the sectors that we discussed today. So maybe that's all I want to say at this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Blanca, very much. I'm wondering if there's any questions from the participants who managed to come back. Right, so I think we covered most of the things. Again, I would like to thank so much Blanca, Patricia, and Constantin for delivering the key messages of the report. And I would like to thank Raed, Bernard Hockman, Bernard Ziller for joining us today and exchange. And I think it was a very, very interesting and very informative session. So it will be posted on YouTube so that other people can also join and enjoy what we have discussed today. And I'm sure it's going to be a first of a series of reports and webinars that we are going to organize with the CMI on this very interesting topic. So I would like to close this session and thank you so much for joining us and take care.